Welcome to the Elevate podcast, and you are going to be part of a brand new experiment today, an episode format we're calling Thinking Thursdays. We'll be doing these occasionally to talk about a current event that has some good leadership lessons or just something we're interested in, and we think the audience will be as well. Joining me as always is Mick Sloan, who oversees production for the Elevate podcast. And today we're going to talk about something I've been pretty vocal about. We're going to talk about what might be the search for the least desirable job in America going on, and that is the president of Columbia University.
You said it. I don't know how much the president of Columbia University gets compensated, but if someone offered it to me, whatever the number is, I would still have to probably think pretty hard about it. Yeah, so look, throw out all the other stuff about why being president of a university has got to be difficult and challenging and frustrating. Columbia has been the epicenter of this really national debate over campus protests related to the war in Gaza, which have been happening on many college campuses over the past year and a half, but have been particularly fiery and controversial at Columbia. Now, some of this is due to the school's Ivy League credentials. Some of it's due to its location in New York City. Some of it probably is because a lot of journalists go to Columbia, and so it has deep media roots in it. But it's also undeniable that the institution has a really checkered history with anti-Semitism, especially in its more activist community. There's actually a really great Franklin Foer piece in The Atlantic from a couple weeks ago that explores this further that we can link to. So we can get into the recent history of Columbia's presidency in just a minute and how that relates to the current search for a president. But first, let's set the expectation up top. From a leadership standpoint, why is this search for president and the presidents who have fallen off, why is this so interesting to you from a leadership standpoint?
Yeah, I think it's, and we'll get into how a university is governed because there's some things that make this really different from a normal, turnaround situation. But as I look at this now, this is a pretty impossible situation for someone coming in. Normally in an organization, look, this is now 2 CEOs gone in a year, unclear whether they were resigned or fired. You think about a normal corporate situation or organization, and that would be, you'd be looking at sort of a turnaround or a reboot or otherwise. But what's different here is it's not clear, and we'll talk about the history and how we got here, but it's not clear to me, or maybe anyone, who's in charge and who is going to decide the path going forward. And then how are you going to get a leader aligned around that path? And then what does that mean from some difficult decisions? Because depending on which strategy you take here, the reformer strategy or the sort of hunker down strategy, there's going to be some real implications. And I'm just not sure. I think the current President Armstrong showed the sort of trying to have the best of both worlds is not going to work. And I think Columbia has gotten itself into a pretty, deep hole here, and obviously is being made of an example of in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, so let's start right here just by table setting what has actually happened. And really quickly off the top, you said that they have lost 2 leaders in the past 8 months. So basically, Minouche Shafik was president of Columbia, had been president since all the protests had started, resigned August 14th, 2024. So we'll get into why that happened in just a minute. And then the interim president who was put in their place, who was Katrina Armstrong, also resigned about a week ago on March 28th. And so, as you've said, I think that this is a really good illustration of the dynamic and the forces that are really, the pressures really that are squeezing Columbia from both sides. We could, before we get into the history, we could talk about the dynamics of what leadership of a campus and an institution has to balance, because it is very much, and this will be familiar to leaders of all stripes, but to really, really simplify it, this is a massive competition between external stakeholders and internal stakeholders, and who you ultimately have to be beholden to as a leader. Do you think that that's fair to say?
Yeah, and look, there's all kinds of implications of the fiduciary model and also just the business model, right? And how it's changed. So let's try to get into all of this. So being the head of an Ivy League university, like in the past, it might have been an academic or someone like that. This is a big job of a multinational corporation where there's lots of constituents, fundraising, otherwise. Coming in at this job with academic credentials, but no leadership or people or public relations or otherwise, particularly given how these schools interact with like that's hard. And I think schools have had to rethink this, these big complex universities. So that's one. Two, the governance is kind of complicated, right? You have a board. The board doesn't have shareholders. So it's not clear who the board is sort of beholden to. You also have a bunch of professors who are tenured, which means they cannot be removed from their job. And you have a model that, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but it sort of is, it's not really self-sustaining. These universities require a ton of tax breaks and outside funding. So they get grants from places like NIH, they get grants from the government. They don't pay taxes on their endowment. They can issue tax-free bonds for infrastructure. While these are private universities, a lot of them, they are subsidized and sponsored by the government and loans and student loan. Like it just doesn't, the revenue doesn't equal the expenses. It doesn't cover the expenses at the end of the day. So
Yeah.
this also creates a dynamic of, I think there's some teachers and like who's in charge? Is it the students? They're one form of customer. Is it the teachers, their employees? Is it the donors? Is it the alumni? A lot of teachers has been frankly, sort of thumb their nose at donors and alumni who basically fund their ability to have tenure. That has never seemed like a great idea to me, to say, look, if you are not self-sufficient and you need outside things, to sort of say we're just going to do whatever we want and ignore whatever the rest of the world want, like that doesn't usually work in any context. And so I think you can do that if you have a self-sustaining model. Again, if you want to run your own business, you're profitable, you can do it as ever you want. If you have a bank or you have investors, the equation changes. And so there's been a lot of pushback from, around academia. Now, obviously the tenet of a university was supposed to be academic freedom, but hey, we're allowed to teach whatever we want to kind of, we're allowed to do whatever we want. And there should be no outside influence, but those outside influences basically help the model run. So this is the complication.
So I think that what you're illustrating here, and to summarize what you just said, hiring a president of a university, like you said, traditionally back in the day, it would be someone who was, a professor who rose up. They were a department chair. They became, and obviously today, especially for something with a global brand and a massive number of stakeholders like Columbia, that would basically be like appointing a professor to run a Fortune 500 company. It is so complicated. There's so much administration. There are so many fiduciary things to worry about. And also, as you just laid out, there's an extraordinary amount of people, relationships to manage, and donors to placate, and, federal and state education regulations that have to be handled very carefully, and endowments to manage, and all of these things. And this is what I think really makes this notable. There is a real sea change, as you were just talking about, of the way that we look at these institutions, because the way that you just described it, of academic freedom and of really, these universities, they've gotten federal funding, they've gotten donor funding. Donors obviously have always had a voice. There has always been some degree of policy direction from the government as part of funding. But what I think is changing, and this was something that we really, really saw with some of Bill Ackman's campaign against Claudine Gay at Harvard, is that real if-then statement of, if I am supplying this institution with large amounts of money through donations, through federal funding, in the case we're about to talk about with Katrina Armstrong, then I expect to have a certain degree of a stake in what happens. And I expect to have a voice when I think that the institution is doing things that I do not necessarily agree with. And I don't even know if necessarily that is totally new. I don't have enough background in academics and academic history to say that for sure. But it's hard to think of another case where that type of dynamic is being litigated in public conversation the way it has been. Do you think that that is fair for me to say?
Yeah, I agree. I think, look, these things have gone on for so long. A lot of times, until someone opens up the hood and shines a light on it, or there's a problem, people are like, oh, well, that doesn't make sense. Like, I talked to someone today who's writing a paper on, like, does our whole current system of NIH grants and how we give it and funneling it through universities, does it even make sense? Right? Should we have a different model? People haven't had those discussions. Then remember, in a modern complex university, again, government based research and administrators doing scientific experiments and teachers teaching undergrads, they're all under the same roof, but they're not really the same thing or the same business model, too. A lot of that gets commingled.
Yeah, and so all of this is to say, you have written and talked on this show extensively about all of the pressures of leaders and the importance of focus and of values and being clear about what you are going to do as a leader and what you're not going to do. And I actually think, as we'll see when we really dig into the recent history of this and how that informs the very difficult choice that Columbia will have to make in terms of who will lead them forward. This is it's almost the most complicated and challenging version of that scenario that so many leaders are dealing with, is how do you navigate a situation where there are no easy options, where you are certainly going to disappoint some important constituency that you lead. The analogies
You're
are
better off really disappointing some people and really than sort of trying to straddle the mid ground. And I think that's what the last president has done. And I just, if the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, something's got to change in order for this to work going forward.
So, on that note, shall we talk about the two most recent presidents of Colombia, the tenured president and then the interim president who succeeded?
Sure. Look, I think a little bit of background too, before, what happened sort of starting after October 7th. And I think what sort of loaded the gun, let's say figuratively. Look, these campuses, this was well covered in Tim Urban's book, What's Our Problem? Also, Coddling in the American Mind. A lot of these campuses had become very ideologically homogeneous over the last couple of years. There was a pretty strong repression of freedom of speech. There was a lot of cancel culture. There was a lot of, if you don't have the right ideas, then you are not welcome here. And speakers chased from campus, and pretty accepted by a lot of these administrations, and kind of in a moment, and a lot around a social justice moment. I think a lot of people were like, okay, I guess this is the new norm. So the October 7th happens, the reaction happens, and suddenly you have a lot of protests and things going on campus. And things started to happen where people were looking objectively and saying, hey, look, you would have never let these things happen with different contexts and different names and different parties. And particularly for Shafik, and I think Colombia has you talked about a sort of history of activism. This was a new situation for her. And there were a bunch of sort of red line moments, I think, where people and students went well beyond free speech into harassment and taking on spaces, and groups were suspended from campus and would come back. And basically they were breaking rules that have existed at a long time for Colombia and that have been enforced consistently for the last years by organizations and people suspended and otherwise and brought in for discussion. Like what groups saw was like these rules aren't being enforced, and they seem a little flexible, so our group was thrown off campus and we'll just come back again because there's no repercussion for this. And as that happened, the behavior got sort of worse and worse, and it ended up with these encampments that were taking over the physical space of campus. Let's just fully move away from anything that was said or shown or whatever during, because there's all kinds of degrees on that. But taking over the campus, determining who could come in, who could come out, like literally saying these type of people aren't welcome, banging all day, disrupting finals, culminating in taking over an entire building that the New York police SWAT team had to come in, all along with no one visibly suspended or expelled. And any of us who are parents will know that, like, when you don't draw a line, or when you're afraid to draw a line and you're negotiating with people who are breaking the rules, like, it's kind of like a hostage negotiation. Like you are just kind of enabling bad behavior. So eventually now the campus is kind of overtaken by a group. It gets to a point where it's not safe for anyone. Shafik has to call in the police because there's no order and no one takes it seriously that they're going to be suspended. And now both sides are very mad at her. The
Yeah.
side that doesn't want any police intervention and thinks that, she turned it into a police state, and the side that says you should have stopped this 10 degrees before it got to this level, and before you're literally, because like normally, look, we don't let people in any other context take a hostage and then say, I want to negotiate. You say, no, you can't. I'm not going to negotiate with you if you're breaking the law. So it just became totally untenable. Graduation was shut down. It was ruined for a lot of families. And I can understand. And I think she was like, I'm in a no-win situation and I'm going to leave.
Yeah, that is the summary of what really happened. And just to lay out a couple of the specific facts that happened. So you talked about occupying buildings. Like Hamilton Hall, which houses the offices of Columbia's deans, was occupied pretty aggressively, I think it is fair to say, by protesters. There was vandalism, there was property damage, there was intimidation of students. There were blocking of spaces, occupying of spaces, the encampments you talked about. And this did, as you just said, this had really, really serious disruptions of how the university operated. As you said, graduation was not held in person because of fears of disruption. And in April, there was a pretty extended period of time where classes were canceled because there was concerns about things really, truly getting out of control. And Minouche Shafik, as you said it, and Franklin Foer actually talked about this as well in the Atlantic piece I mentioned earlier, just didn't seem prepared. This was like an all-time example of a person being hired expecting to do one role and then it turning into something incredibly
She
different.
worked at the International Monetary Fund. She was like a policy person, probably good at fundraising. This is not what she was expecting, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and so I think that regardless of what you think Shafik should have done, whether she should have shown leniency to protesters or whether she had shown more effort to discipline them and to stop what was happening and keep things contained to just expression of peaceful speech and of peaceful protest. But what she actually ended up doing, as you just laid out, was kind of ignoring things and then setting these quote unquote red lines that didn't end up getting enforced.
She had multiple deadlines.
Yeah.
That were then not enforced. Like, here's the deadline, here's the consequence, and then it passed, and we'll give more time, and this went on for a while.
And there is simply no denying the fact that her departure was ignited by what transpired on campus, her response to what transpired, and how that response was perceived both on and off campus, because she did not make anyone happy with her response. And she definitely tried, I think, almost to middle ground it, but ended up being, look, it is a really negative word, but feckless
no
is the right
value-based statements of even to say, this is freedom of speech, but I find this speech deplorable, right? This was the test that everyone failed in front of Congress, or we don't do this at Columbia, or I agree in this right, but this behavior, like there were just no like strong foundational actions or statements which made a disaster on both sides, right? Like, it's pretty amazing that you could have both sides equally as unhappy. You'd think you'd like kind of choose sides and one person would be happy and one wouldn't. But I think because there was no clear principles, that was the outcome. And look, it's hard. Columbia is in a city, but it is hard if you want to not think that this is a leadership problem. It's hard to not argue that Columbia and NYU or Columbia and Brown have totally different student makeups and beliefs and ideologies. And yet the behavior on these campuses and what transpired was totally different.
Yeah, it was a uniquely, again, there is the reason that there was an epicenter of it. And Columbia does have, again, look, Columbia's student body probably, if you stacked it up against a lot of similar institutions, similar Ivy League institutions, for example, there is probably not enough of a difference between Columbia's student body and the others to like that
Right.
explains this
That's what
type
I
of
was saying.
behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I just repeated what you said. So Shafik steps down, and her statement included a note that her tenure included, quote, a period of turmoil where it has been difficult to overcome divergent views across our community, to say the least. I think that's accurate. And so I think that you could call her strategy for managing all of these protests an absence of a strategy, and that objectively did some pretty serious harm to Columbia's reputation. Do you think that that's the right way to characterize it? And what do you think is the really important lesson from that?
Yeah, I didn't see a strategy. And usually when someone leaves, again, there's been no principled statements. There's only been wishy-washy stuff. Like, were you fired? Are you leaving? To say that this is an impossible situation, or the board to say this is not good leadership. Like, it's been all this no fault insurance stuff, which lets everyone hide behind, oh, my best efforts. Like, I kind of want to see anyone from, look, if you listen, there's a long interview that the chancellor of Vanderbilt did on a podcast. And it's not surprising that Vanderbilt has been totally under control. They had one flare up where they took over, and then they talk about their values, they talk about their principles, things that were outside of that. People were held accountable. They were, and never happened again. And they went back to discussion and dialogue and said, look, these are our foundational principles, and we're going to act in them, and we talk about it and we teach them. Like, it's not a surprise. There's just been no value orientation in anything that's gone on.
And I recognize the fact that Shafik was in a really extraordinarily unenviable position. This is a bit like a leader who is overseeing a massive scandal that they didn't start, but they had to manage it, and the management just did not go well. So when it's that type of thing, is it really just you have to lean on your values, you have to take a stand, you have to be consistent? Is that really the failure here of not doing those things, or is there? I think
when you any organization, when you visibly, and I will go to the mat with anyone on this around whether did they hold different people to different rules and standards where the behaviors were exactly the same, and is unequivocally yes. And so when you do that, when you hold different standards, when you aren't clear on what you value, sometimes you have to say, I hate the outcome of this, but this is the rule. Right. And that's why all these people ended up getting fired after that testimony, because they couldn't say that in front of Congress. They couldn't say, even if I believe in free speech, the calling for the genocide comment, like, this is abhorrent, that everyone was trying to play politics. Like, you just don't feel like anyone's saying what they really feel or mean in this. And they're willing to die on whatever that vine is. And I would have liked to see either of them leave and make a statement like, look, I don't think that this is right, and that's why I'm leaving. And Armstrong, I don't think the government should interfere, or I think that these are sensible changes that need to be made, and a lot of people aren't willing to make them. I mean, everyone's trying to play nicety, but this is the problem. And this is why I don't know how, I mean, this will be the theme. I don't know how you get a different outcome without changing something pretty radically here.
Well, so let's talk about the first attempt to get a different outcome. So Shafik steps down in August 2024 and is replaced by an interim president named Katrina Armstrong. And it does seem like Armstrong's approach from the beginning was to try and bridge the divide that Shafik could not. And similarly, to sort of heal the divisive reputation that Columbia had gotten nationwide. So, for example, her first message as interim president included this quote: the habit of critical thinking and humility that gives birth to tolerance of contrary points of view is the most essential lesson taught in Columbia's classrooms and the intellectual common ground that unifies the many scholarly pursuits found across our campus. But she wasn't done, so that was in August, right after she took over. And then in September, around when the academic year had started, she addressed the protests a bit more directly. So in a letter to the community, she made a specific reference to protecting free speech, but also talked about Columbia's code of conduct and its commitment to it. And so she said, quote, consistent and effective implementation of our rules requires a rigorous framework for how we respond to any situation where concerns arise about the impact of an event on our academic mission or the safety of our community. So again, consistent and effective implementation, a rigorous framework for response to any situation. That is kind of what you were talking about was missing from Shafik's tenure, right? Is that
Yeah, I mean
fair?
these are the words, right? And what's interesting about this, and I think this needs to be pointed out consistently, not until, the problems with the government started, but there was actually no policy changes here, right? This is what they were basically saying was we need to enforce our own policies. And they didn't want to say that they didn't, but that's we need to have institutions. These are things that should have been there all along. And so there's kind of an admission there that it wasn't there. And look, the temperature came down and a little bit. And so, things got better. But what also didn't happen as time went on was there really wasn't anyone back to this check and balance system. Columbia has a kind of inmate asylum problem in that a lot of these professors who are sympathetic to the student causes still have the ability to overrule suspension. Remember, suspensions like in the old days were kind of academic. You cheated, you lied. The modern university has a lot more things that you can do that aren't related to the classroom behavior. And frankly, if you are violating a straight up policy of the school outside of the classroom, your teachers who are your friends really shouldn't be in a position and your classmates to exonerate you for that. That is a poor system of checks and balances. And what happened was most of the people that were suspended, almost everyone that took over the building, who broke the law, went to jail, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, they weren't suspended. They weren't expelled. And there were very few things announced publicly. So the longer it went on and the longer there was no actual accountability, those words started to ring a little hollow. So it was before we'll get to the ultimatum that they got, but before the ultimatum, 0 suspensions or expulsions had been announced for the takeover of the building from
Hamilton Hall.
Hamilton Hall, which was now what, like almost a year ago?
Yeah.
Or
At that
yeah,
point, it was like 6 months earlier. Yeah.
yeah, it was
And
6 months earlier. And let's be honest, if a bunch of fraternity guys had, for a prank, had jumped through the windows, smashed it, taken a janitor hostage, and locked themselves in this is the test, they all would have been suspended. And this is the thing where if you give people sodium pentothal and you ask them this question, and this is where, again, it doesn't matter what cause they were supporting, social justice or Rush, it can't. You have to treat the actions similarly.
yeah. And the thing is, the activity was not as that happened on campus this past fall. It's not as if everything stopped. What I really suspect happened is there was a presidential election that dominated the news cycle from September till January, really, because then there's the post election meltdown from the Democratic establishment and Democratic voters. And this just, it's funny. I expected the Columbia protests and the campus protests across the board to be much more of a political issue in the election, but they really weren't. And I think that there were just so many other things to cover. But things really took a dramatic turn after Donald Trump was inaugurated early this year. And so his administration, again, as you talk about, Armstrong takes a different approach verbally, but there's not a lot of actual policy changes behind this. And so the Trump administration canceled $400 million in federal funding to Columbia and essentially offered to reinstate it if certain changes took place on campus. And I'm simplifying a little bit, but those changes included enforcing disciplinary actions for the occupation of Hamilton Hall and for the encampments that had taken place the spring before. And they did clarify in the letter, which was reported by New York Times and other outlets, meaningful discipline meant expulsion or multi-year suspension. They called for the banning of face masks at protests. They required the delivery of a plan to hold student groups accountable for violations of university policy. There's a bit of complicated and surprising background for why so many student groups are wrapped up in this that we can get into if you're interested. But so that's another. Adopting and promulgating a definition of anti-Semitism across Columbia. Empowering Columbia's security and law enforcement to counter activities that are against university code, comprehensive admissions reform, and probably the most controversial, which has caused a lot of the uproar, is the call to put the Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies Department at Columbia under something called academic receivership, which is a pretty rare action that puts a department under external leadership outside of that department's faculty. And this one in particular really touched off a firestorm. I should note, for example, that Erwin Chemerinsky, a Cal Berkeley constitutional law scholar who, and you cannot make this up, whose home was actually the site of a very controversial protest related to the Gaza war, where students interrupted a dinner that he was hosting, said that this receivership demand is unconstitutional. And so that's the rundown. So Columbia gets these demands, and they're suddenly put in an even more extraordinary position than the one that we just talked about. That
yeah, and the government's saying, "Look, let's just stop." The government's saying, "Look, we give you money. You have failed under some of your title obligations and other obligations over the years where schools will lose money, and you've failed to really address this anti-Semitism problem, and so we're going to withhold money until you do so." And with the exception of the last one, which is a little complicated, and whether it's unconstitutional, let me try to sort of explain why they did it. None of these things seem they seem upholding of existing policy and creating, in the same thing you would do around racism or otherwise, creating a fair and safe learning environment for everyone. And I can't debate the constitutionality of the last one. I can tell you what they were trying to do was say, look, so this department is known for not letting in any professors that have ideological differences, and there's no one kind of looking at the classes being taught. What that was driven by was there was a professor there, Joseph Mahmood, who was one of the first on October 8th to come out and talk about how what happened the day before was extraordinary and exhilarating, and he is kind of notoriously anti-Semitic, is teaching a course on Zionism next semester. This would be equivalent to, just so people, again, are we judging in the same context, having David Duke as a visiting professor potentially teaching a course on racism. I think a lot of people might be up in arms irrespective of the confidentiality. So yes, the last one was probably the most controversial, but Columbia didn't actually agree to put it in receivership. What they did, what I think was okay for the government, was they said, look, we're going to put an administrator over this who's going to try to look at curriculum and decide about whether we're being objective and appropriate in our balance of our class offerings.
So what do you think that Katrina Armstrong should have done in response to this demand from the Trump administration?
Look, this gets to the heart of sort of what do you value and what do you want to do. I can't tell her what she want to do, and I don't know who her boss is. I don't know what she does either, and I don't know what the mandate is. So I think you're fully willing to say, look, we're not going to do this. Leave us alone. This is our private institution. But then the government's fully entitled not to give you the money. And so if you really believe in that and you believe in what you're doing hard enough, this is where a lot of the hypocrisy comes into play again. Like, this is, your tenure is funded by this, your research is funded by this. Or, she had to take a hard nose and say, look, like, which I think she tried to do, that this is going to cost us a ton of money. These changes are reasonable. She actually did sort of say we did screw up a lot of this stuff and we own that we could have done this. These changes are reasonable. And even if you don't like Trump, you don't like why it's being done, you think it's a political witch hunt, not, actually, other than the receivership, none of these are really controversial. Like, none of these really affect your ability to do what you need to do and teach. And we need to do this, or it's going to cost a lot of colleagues our money and our jobs. And look, this is causing a huge rift between the humanities departments and the science departments and stuff, because I think they have very different ideologies, and humanities departments do not require this sort of external funding, while the sciences and cannot run without it. So it's kind of like, hey, you guys are running off with this behavior and we have to bear your consequences. And you don't have to bear it. You're not going to lose your tenure. No, you're not going to lose your money. I'm going to lose my job. So that, I think that was a little bit of a civil war between humanities and the sciences as well.
Yeah. So all of this is to say, I think that we could debate whether it was reasonable what the administration was asking or whether it was reasonable to make the ask at all. I suspect that we don't totally agree on that, and I don't know if we'll get anywhere by litigating it here. But I do think it is very notable to say, just leaving aside the fact that of whether the administration, not the fact, but the opinion of whether the administration should have put this type of pressure, and especially the receivership element of it, which is more than the other stuff, which are more about safety and about maintaining order on the campus. The receivership is more about that infringement of that. I think you could call it a core value of academic
Right.
freedom
Freedom.
and
Yeah.
autonomy. But what is undeniable is what you were just saying, that Armstrong is put in this position where she has to decide what to do, knowing that realistically, there is probably not a way to get the Trump administration to totally back off. As you were saying, like, I think that there probably still will be legal challenges to some of the elements of what's being demanded here. I expect there will be court cases and everything like that. But there is certainly an avenue and a version of events that could transpire here, that there is nothing that can be done to stop the administration from pulling the funding if they decide that they want to. And so it's this really, really, again, I would say unfair position for Armstrong to be in, where she's dealing with whether to compromise on this thing that will cause massive, massive internal and external strife from the university's alums, from their professors, from their administrators. But knowing that refusing to bend on this will be a serious, serious blow to the campus's ability to remain solvent and will lead to jobs being cut. Like, that
And
actually,
not the jobs, and not the jobs of the people who are emphatic about it, right?
yeah.
Like that is the sort of, I don't think we're seeing enough what's going on inside, but that is a huge dynamic where some people are making want to make an example out of it, even though it doesn't hurt them.
A really good
Yeah.
example. I mean, Johns Hopkins lost a lot of federal funding for similar reasons, not related to campus protests, but related to some ideological rifts between the administration and between the university. And a lot of scientific research roles were cut as a result of that, because, as you just said, they are more dependent on the steady flow of federal funding. And that makes sense, because, if we're being completely and totally honest about it, sorry to pick on, what, I'll pick on philosophy. The government is not sending hundreds of millions of dollars to Columbia because they
Correct.
want cutting
Yeah.
edge philosophy research. There is a bit of a social contract here where I think that things are starting to get a little unprecedented and different, that universities say, you give us our funding, we give you this research that allows America to continue to lead the world in innovation, to continue to attract the best possible people to study here and eventually work here and create the incredible things that our economy is built upon. And in exchange for that, we have these other programs that aren't directly related to that also teach classes and write papers and have theories on
But
things
are
that a
partially
lot of
covered, but are partially covered by the overhead by some of that funding or the revenue it generates.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But it's sort of we're ultimately giving you what you want, and we're going to do some things that we may not like, but that's our prerogative. Like, that is certainly, I think, how even Columbia's like non-ideological professors and administrators feel like. I would imagine that there are a lot of protests, or not a lot. There are a lot of faculty and administrators who disagree, or ideologically or in terms of methods, with the protests that created all of this controversy in the first place, but still think that giving in to the demands is the wrong thing to do. Doesn't that seem feasible to you?
Yeah, and look, but they don't have to bear the consequences. That's the problem, right? They don't have to bear the consequences of that decision, which causes a whole bunch of other problems. Or maybe they do, and they say, "Look, it's worth my colleague losing their job to do this. Maybe not it's worth losing my job." But fast forward. So what did Armstrong do? As far as we can tell, and from the art, she, sort of gave everything that the administration or whichever group was Department of Education was sort of
Department
looking
of
for.
Education.
Department of Education was looking for, including look, banning masks in a protest, like we would not let people walk around in hoods and protest. There are laws about this, actually, that you can't do this since the days of the KKK. This is where, again,
Actually,
yeah,
before COVID, you couldn't go in. Most Seven
right.
Elevens wouldn't allow you in with a mask on.
Right. They had to change the law to let you wear a mask during
Yeah.
COVID. And when you're particularly being aggressive and you're covering your identity, like this is not a great idea.
So focusing back on what actually happened. So it seems that Colombia had agreed to comply with a lot of the changes that were required. Linda McMahon, Secretary of Education, said as much as CNN's State of the Union on March 23rd. Armstrong's announcement to the community was a bit less definitive on that front. It didn't make any reference to academic receivership for the Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies Department, for example. And the Columbia Spectator did report that in meetings with faculty, Armstrong essentially waved away that the concessions that were being made would really have much material impact on what would happen.
Right. So she said what the administration needed to hear, then sort of a more neutral thing with the whole campus, and then in a meeting with irate professors that was recorded from someone, she kind of was like, we don't really have to do any of this anyway. I'll paraphrase. This stuff is kind of optional anyway, which then leaked the next day.
Yeah, and
So
I suspect, like, my suspicion would be that Armstrong probably thought that the administration would have limited mechanisms to enforce some of the changes, and also they probably expected that there would be some legal challenges that could tie it up and may even prevail in
but now
Colombia's
I
favor.
don't know what she stands for. And I think
Yeah,
the professors don't think they know what she stands for. And I think we're back to the same Shafik problem on both sides. People don't know what they stands for. So I can't tell whether she was fired or whether she quit because she agreed with the professors or didn't agree with the professors, because everyone's mad at her, I guess.
I think that she probably realized that by publicly capitulating, she was subject to a lot of news coverage of Colombia bows to Trump, and she also probably was not considered fully credible in the face of the faculty that she attempted to reassure, because I think a lot of the people who are most upset with her probably, and look, I will say understandably, because I understand this point of view, thought that Colombia should have just held the line, damn the consequences. And look, I understand from like an ideological and from a moral standpoint, I understand that point of view, even if the consequences could have been very grave. But
Okay with that, right? And I think this is the problem, and her problem and the university's problem going forward is someone's got to decide. You got to come into them faculty and say, I know you're pissed, I know you feel violated, I know, but I cannot cause permanent damage to this organization and result in the loss of all these jobs, and I'm not willing to do that on ideological grounds that I don't think actually really change the behavior of us on this campus. My job is to, like you'd say in a layoff, to save the most jobs for the most people. And this is where we are. And I made the best decision I could. Or you could say, we're going to tell them to go screw themselves and we'll bear the consequences. And by the way, these might be the consequences. And are we okay with bearing that? You just can't choose a la carte from both those menus, right?
and again, this brings it back to external and internal pressures. And Colombia is not a business, but this, exactly as you just described it, is very similar to a dynamic that a lot of businesses have known very well in the past few years, where they have these very unforgiving market dynamics and external factors.
There's just
You know,
bad
call
choices sometimes, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and calling what's happening with the Trump administration the equivalent of a market dynamic isn't quite right, but like is something outside of the organization that is drastically affecting the prospects within it. And so basically in cases like that, as you have talked over and over, you have to be really decisive and let people know where you stand. And I think that if Armstrong had written like an editorial in the New York Times and said why I am not giving in to the Trump administration, I think that probably would have rallied a lot of support around. And if she had given a statement that said, I know that this is disappointing a lot of people, but I feel like I have to protect the ability that this university has to employ the best people and do the best research in the country, I think that would have upset some people, but also would have had
But
people
not
rally around
everyone.
that.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of analogy back to the the Capitol Hill testimony of saying, I believe in freedom of speech and I believe in calling for genocide is horrific. But now there's a whole thing of whether they were consistent on that, but saying, look, I have to let that go. It violates all my values if I believe in freedom of speech, right? This would be the same thing. Like, I do not think this is right. I think whatever, but I have to make the best decision for the most people. And that's my job. And that's what I was paid to do as a leader. So this all gets us to like, who the hell is going to take this job?
Yeah, let's get to it.
Yeah.
I think that all of this table saying and all of this context really feeds into it. So I think it's all related. But you wrote about this on LinkedIn, I think on Sunday, and characterized the choice as follows. Columbia can basically either go external and bring in an outsider who's kind of a reformer, who's committed to really changing things, both explicitly demanded by the administration, but also kind of taking aim at some of the more challenging like ideological debates that have been happening on a lot of campuses that helped lead to this. Or they can go with an insider who will try to maintain the status quo and fight the good fight, essentially picking one of the courses of action rather than attempting to do a little bit of both like Armstrong. How do you think about this choice, and how do you think they should think about this?
Look, I think it's binary. And because of these control dynamics, like if you were Spencer Stewart and you called me for this job, what I would want to know is like, first of all, I can't do what I need to do. So if I was going to come in, I'd be like, Columbia's got irredeemable culture problem and I need to fix it. I would fire all the leadership and I would replace the teachers and I, this is what you would do in a company, but you can't do that.
The professors, you keep calling them teachers.
Professors, I don't know, maybe they don't deserve that distinction, some of them, but the right, you'd come in and say these people are toxic to the culture I want to build, and you'd move on. But without that and without the backing, I just don't know who anyone who thinks they can step into this. You're missing most of the tools that you would have in a leadership, which is to come in, define the culture, clarify the values, say you're with us or you're not with us. Right. That would be the sort of go-to move to any reformer. And the board's with me and I have their 100% support. And this is going to be painful, but this is what we're going to fix. And we're going to be a totally different type of organization and whatever. Because they can't offer that, I kind of like, I hate to say this, but I kind of feel like they should probably find an insider who wants to fight this fight. I just don't know whether they're going to be realistic with the stakeholders about what's at stake. And then you can't sort of cry over that afterwards, right? Because you're a private institution, you are more than willing to tell the government there are plenty of them. There are plenty of religious institutions and stuff, then they go to hell. Like we don't want to take your money and we don't want your influence. You'll have a lot of research leave the university. What would happen in this case is that all the scientists and all these people would leave the university. They would go set up at other places. They would get their money there. Columbia would be reduced to sort of like more of a liberal arts school. The tuition would probably need to collapse. They wouldn't be able to cover the salaries and the administration and all these people work for. So if they want to teach those things and do it for less money and more classes and like that is fully within their right, but there are always consequences to those decisions. And the one thing you can't do is expect this Goldilocks, to sort of stick by your values. Sticking by your values has pain. And I think that is a missing equation from the professorial side.
Yeah, and I think to say the least, someone probably is not going to have much success coming in and taking the approach that Armstrong did of saying, we're going to publicly give them what they want, but we are not going to, we're not going to change that much materially. And this is again, it is complicated by the fact that this particular administration is one where the predictability, it's very hard to predict their commitment to a course of action here.
That is very true. Yeah.
Look, it is not entirely out of the question that Armstrong could have said, yeah, sure, we're doing all this stuff, and then been more careful about getting protests from getting out of hand and restricted that activity more, and not made all of these significant changes to the academic departments that they were asking for. Maybe the administration just would have moved on. I don't know. And it is possible that is what Armstrong was betting on, but it is very clear that was untenable. And I do think actually it is a question of values, because I think academic freedom is a very paramount value to Columbia. And it would appear that the school may not be able to decide how they define and promote that value and still retain the federal funding that they depend upon.
But
So,
you can also not. And I agree with you 100%. But I'll veer into politics for a second. But you cannot say that academic freedom is a value and have a 98% ideological base in one direction and basically not allow other ideas or other voices in. Right. So that, like, you're being inconsistent with yourself. So if they want to go that way, there has to be some change anyway. Right. You can't have cancel culture and academic freedom. They don't go hand in hand.
look, Franklin Foer again, he put it really well, and this is a pretty liberal guy. So he said Trump's autocratic presence unbalances every debate, but just because his administration is exploiting the issue of anti Semitism does not mean that anti Jewish activism is not an issue at Columbia. Somewhere along the way, and this is the really important, somewhere along the way, one of the nation's greatest universities lost its capacity to conduct intellectual arguments over contentious issues without resorting to hyperbole and accusations of moral deficiency. And I think it is that flaw that, you're right, does need to be fixed, because I think that you could make a really good case that that is working against that academic.
Yeah. So look, back to where we started. If you could choose, I don't know, if you could choose CEO of Boeing, president of Columbia, this is a very hard choice. But I think it's an interesting, what we try to do here is sort of a live case study. Like, this is why people get the big bucks. This is hard. And I'm very interested to see how this plays out, because I think it's complicated. I don't think there are easy answers. And great leadership requires being principled when there are only difficult choices. And I'm curious to see. Look, I think this is going to go down as a case study in horrible leadership. I think maybe the person who could figure this out will go down as a case study in heroic leadership.
I have, well, actually, do you have a stop at 4:30?
Yeah, I got 2 minutes.
Okay. So I have two quick questions to you to cap this off. Do you think Colombia's next president or interim president is doomed to fail?
If nothing else changes in the circumstances, or people haven't been clear about the power structure or who's sort of like in charge, I don't see how the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different result. So you'll know very early when that person comes in, and whether you're hearing messages that sound like platitudes or messages that sound very resolute in one direction or the other.
I think we're in an era where leaders who are embroiled in culture have a very hard time righting the ship. We've had the presidency change hands in 3 consecutive terms, and who knows what'll happen next time. So I agree with you. And finally, prediction time. You talked about what they should do. What will Columbia do? Outsider, insider, or some cursed attempt to middle ground it?
I don't know if it's interim. Look, someone stronger than me. I think it's going to be insider. I just can't see an outsider really taking this role right now without some promise that they could go in and really change things and blow things up, which I'm not sure that they can be given. So I'm going to go on insider.
Well, you heard it here first. We'll see what happens.
All right. Thank you for listening, everyone. Look, reach out. We'd love to hear what you thought of this new format. We've got plenty more topics for debate. We hope you enjoyed this Thinking Thursday. And you can reach out with any feedback at robertglazer.com/contact. Don't miss this week's interview that launched on Tuesday with Chasa Urich, who joined me to talk about her new book, Shatterproof. And if you haven't subscribed to the show, follow or subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app. Until next time, keep elevating.